What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite builds in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, ahead of its Enhanced Edition release and just after its Midnight Isles DLC release, so naturally it's on my mind quite a bit lately, so sorry if I'm inundating you with Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. But a couple things to get out of the way towards the start of the video here. When it comes to talking builds in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, there's a few things you have to keep in mind. The difficulty that you are playing the game on being the primary thing. On normal, just about everything that attempts to be an actual build is usually going to be fine. And then once you start hitting core, hard, and unfair, you kind of have to rein in your expectations and use a build that is built for those things, which unfortunately, in the case of unfair, cuts out a ton of what is available to you. Which is why I wanted to mention that a lot of my builds are usually built for core difficulty, because while I have beaten the game on unfair, personally, I just prefer core because I feel like unfair restricts too many options in a game that is otherwise full of options. And while I will be presenting a build or two that can be used on unfair, if you're looking at this video because you've never played the game before, I would not recommend playing on unfair until you know exactly what you're doing, because even if you use a build for it, if you don't understand all the mechanics and how those mechanics translate to this game engine, you're probably setting yourself up for a bad time. But with all of that said, let's actually dive into this thing and talk about my favorite. Now, I'm going to start this off with one that you've probably seen a ton of variations of. It's actually a relatively popular build. However, there's tons of variations to it. The exact dips, feats, when to take what, that kind of stuff. But it is the Magus Sword Saint archetype combined with the Duelist. And I'll be posting links to my versions of these down below. But what this build really excels at is, of course, melee DPS. Sword Saint is actually one of the better classes to play for melee because you get access to a wide variety of spells through your class, and you can actually use those spells in melee. They get a class feature called Spell Combat that allows them to deliver touch spells or touch range spells through their weapon, which means they get their regular attacks plus they get to cast a spell every turn, which can be very, very strong. But in addition to that, they get, of course, defensive buffs, and that's before we even start talking about the Duelist build. So the Duelist part of this, which is a prestige class, allows them to parry and counterattack. So on top of an already very strong regular melee attack, they will get to counterattack and attack of opportunity very regularly, usually for like 400 damage a hit, which is one of the many reasons it's a very popular style of play. Plus, you combine the fact that Sword Saint is honestly just a fantastic archetype, and you have yourself a great build. But that brings us to probably the most interesting build, I would say, on this list in terms of what it's trying to do, and that is my Unholy Nightingale build. This is primarily a Skald build. Now, it might not seem like it when you look at the Skald class, but truth be told, Skald is actually one of the best classes in Wrath of the Righteous. They get a variety of buffs, they can do a ton of damage, they can buff your entire party. There's a lot that a Skald can do for you, which is why you'll often see it in unfair. Now, my version of this uses the Demon Dancer archetype on top of the Demon specifically Mythic Path, essentially to give ourselves just a ton of natural and unarmed attacks. And then just for flavor, I threw in a bunch of summoning spells, though that is easily adjusted if you don't want to do that. So this build is going to see you every turn using a ton of abilities to buff your entire party with the Skald's bardic performance, more or less. Or in the case of the Demon Dancer, you can pass on a rage effect to the rest of your party. With the Demon Mythic Path specifically, you can get just a ton of natural attacks. And I enjoyed throwing the summons in there just to honestly kind of do something different, but also because they make good shields, frankly, on higher difficulties, but that part is certainly not necessary. And if you want to talk like theoretical maximums, this is a build that can do in the ballpark of 1,000 plus damage a turn. Again, provided you actually get the rolls to do that. I think a lot of people talk damage and they just talk just the theoretical maximum, like that's what you're going to be doing every turn, and that's just not true. Now, the downside of this build in particular, though, is that it is difficult to play. Basically, you have to toggle a lot of stuff on and off. There's a ton of mechanics to engage with, and you're just interacting with a lot of systems all at the same time. So this is a build you really need to be playing in turn-based, and you need to know what to toggle and when to toggle it. So there's a bit of a higher skill ceiling with this particular build, which is why honestly I wouldn't recommend it to beginners. But nonetheless, it's a lot of fun, but I would definitely check out the Skald class in general. If you haven't tried it out yet, it's actually really good. Now, that brings us to number 3 on the list, and this is a build that I actually made for Ninio specifically, and it's probably the only build on this list I wouldn't recommend putting on your main character, and I call it the Fear Monger. Moreover, this is a build that actually requires several items you'll find throughout the game, which I don't do a lot of, typically speaking. Most of the builds are fine with just like generic equipment. However, this particular build really does require specific pieces of equipment to be effective. Luckily, you can find most of it at the beginning of Act 3 and in the middle of Act 2, which is when you start getting the spells you need to cast anyway, so it kind of works out. But the point of this particular build is to just straight up one-shot a lot of enemies through the spells Phantasmal Killer and Weird. On top of this, it's also a party buff and support class. It does have a few ways of dealing damage outside of just one-shotting things, but primarily speaking, it's buffs on you, debuffs on the enemy, and trying to one-shot things. And because of this, I wouldn't recommend it for your main character because there's some situations in the game where this build just does not do well. For instance, against mind-affecting enemies, which are immune to the attempted one-shots in most cases. But Phantasmal Killer and Weird are really cool spells. If you're unfamiliar with them, what they do is force the enemy to roll a couple saves. If they fail them both, they just die. This is kind of counteracted by the fact that it's hard to get the DC of those spells high enough to reliably kill something. However, in this particular game, we get a bunch of items to help us do exactly that and raise the DC of our spells for this so high that basically enemies will have to roll a perfect nat 20 or they just die. Now, Phantasmal Killer, which is a 4th level spell, will do this to one target at a time, but then there's Weird. This is a level 9 spell, but it is an AoE version of Phantasmal Killer. Now, the main problem with this approach is that there are enemies that are immune to this as well, but in this particular adventure path, not that many enemies are immune to it, but anything immune to fear or mind-affecting effects is what you have to look out for. Something being immune to death effects will actually not make them immune to this because it's not a death effect. It's actually fear that is killing the enemy. But mind-affecting effects and fear are what you need to look out for. If a monster's immune to those, this won't work. But even some bosses aren't immune to this, so it's very possible to just one-shot bosses with this. In fact, you can do it to quite a few bosses, and it is hilarious. Now, this is a build that becomes unviable once you start hitting unfair. I've seen people use it on hard, but at that point, the saving throws of the monsters get so high, it's difficult to effectively use this. But on core and below, very doable. And honestly, kind of hilarious, because there's nothing quite like watching a demon monologue and then just murdering it in one turn, with literally one spell. Now that brings us to number 4 on the list, and that is my Demon Slayer Ranger archetype build that I just call the Demon Slayer. I love this build for this game because I think it is thematically perfect. Obviously, we're fighting a lot of demons in this adventure path, and I think the Demon Slayer Ranger really makes the most sense in terms of things to play because you're really, really good at killing demons. Now, outside of this adventure path, honestly, not the best archetype in the world, but because like 80 to 90% of what you fight in this game is demons, it works out very, very well. And on top of that, it's incredibly easy to play, plus you get an animal companion. So what more could you ask for? But honestly, if you've played a ranger, you pretty much know what to expect here. I like to go the archer route for this. You just shoot at demons until they're dead. Your animal companion can help you do that. You're going to get a ton of just passive buffs to hitting and dealing damage to demons specifically, so you really don't have to do anything extra on your end outside of just choose what to attack, etc. But most of the buffs and bonuses are very passive and you don't have to engage with a ton of systems. And this is a build that is good because it's effective on higher difficulties while simultaneously being very easy to play, which is why this one I absolutely would recommend to newcomers. And then last but not least, we have my Shaman Angel build, and that is called the Holy Spirit. Now, this build is admittedly a little bit silly. But basically, what I wanted to do was take a dual-wielding shaman, which can actually merge their spellbook with the Angel Mythic Path, which gives them access to level 10 spells, because shamans are full divine casters, meaning they get all full level 9 spells, provided they level up. But basically what that means is that they can merge their spellbook with the Angel, which gives them access to incredibly powerful spells very early. Now you could go full caster with this, but Shamans, you're usually kind of a mix of melee and casting anyway, or at least that's how I like to play them, I suppose. So what I did here was I made a dual-wielding Shaman, and then I went Angel, and you can cast a bunch of really high damage spells to demons with this. One of them is, of course, ironically called Wrath of the Righteous, which is fun, but this one is a bit themed. Now, while it might not seem like it, because I'm not exactly min-maxing this thing here, this is very much so playable on higher difficulties. Now, honestly, everything about Unfair kind of sucks until you get to Act 3, and this is one of those builds that is just like that. If you can make it to Act 3 and Unfair with this thing, it gets very viable because you pick up the Angel Mythic path, which is where a lot of your bonuses come from, and then at that point it's actually pretty doable. But like a lot of classes, it does struggle in that early game on Unfair. But my goal with this build really was to kind of lean into like a battle-hardened Angel charging in, which is kind of the theme of this game in a lot of ways. But I didn't want to go two-hander, so I decided to go dual-wielding, which is a lot of fun. And overall, that makes a build that is honestly kind of strange, but nonetheless, it's a lot of fun. It's pretty viable on higher difficulties as well. And like most of my builds, it kind of does something a little different that I thought was really cool. But there you guys go, 5 of my favorites. My regular viewers will probably notice I didn't mention a kineticist at all, which is actually my favorite class. That is by design. I talk about Kineticist a lot. I made like a 40-minute video about how to play them, and I figured I'd mix it up here and talk about some other stuff I enjoyed quite a bit. But that's pretty much all I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it gave you more ideas about what to do when you play the game, or for when you're playing the game right now maybe. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.